Welcome to the BMES Professional Development Webinar, Trends in Industry. I'm Clark Wilson, and I'll be your moderator today. Today's webinar will focus on trends in industry. I'm Clark Wilson. I'm a patent attorney at the IP firm Merchant & Gould. I have a master's in bioengineering and focus my practice on representing medical device clients. I'm also the business development team lead for BMES in the BMES Industry Committee. A couple of housekeeping items. This archive recording will be available shortly after the webinar on the BMES website. You can submit questions throughout the webinar by using the online chat function on the left-hand side of the screen. Your questions will be addressed after the speaker presentation. Please take a few minutes to complete the brief survey following the webinar to provide us with your feedback. So it looks like some people participated in the first polling question. It looks like about half the room is students. The next would be faculty, and about an even split between postdoctoral fellows and industry professionals. If you could all take a minute to answer this second polling question. Then we can look at the results. Okay, it looks like we've got some people maybe still in school. So we've got some no industry experience, about a third. And greater than 10 years is about the same as internship only. So we've got a nice mix, and I think you'll get some good information. So we have a very esteemed speaker today. Adrienne Lovink is a partner at DRG Consulting. In her role, Adrienne leads a team of consultants located throughout North America, Europe, and Asia. Her specific area of focus is to support leading medical device, pharmaceutical, and technology companies on issues related to commercialization, strategy, product and portfolio development, and market access. During her 10-year tenure, greater than 10-year tenure at DRG, Adrienne has been instrumental in broadening the company's expertise in market sizing and opportunity assessments, quantitative market modeling, and scenario planning, due diligence, conjoint medical billing and claims-based research, hospital reimbursement, and emerging technology adoption. Adrienne regularly engages with industry partners to support professionals devoted to developing and using engineering and technology to advance human health, and she sits on the Industry Advisory Board for BMES. She's active as a guest lecturer for graduate programs at leading universities in North America, where she actively engages in discussions related to the impact of healthcare reform, the convergence of biopharma, medtech, and digital, and the opportunities for regenerative medicine, diagnostics, and therapeutics. Prior to joining DRG, Adrienne worked as a research scientist for a leading pharmaceutical company. She finished first in her class with a bachelor's in engineering from the University of Toronto, and she holds a graduate degree from the Institute of Biomaterials and Biomedical Engineering. With that, I will let Adrienne proceed.
Hi, everyone. It's a sincere pleasure to talk to you today and to share some of the industry trends that we're seeing in our consulting practice at DRG. As Clark mentioned, I am an engineer by training, and one of the things that I'm really passionate about and that energizes me in the type of work that we do is just watching technology development and watching how technology is influencing the evolution of medical devices and of healthcare in general. So what I'd like to talk to you today about is just to share some of our thinking and to share a little bit of insight about what we're seeing as it relates to the convergence of biopharma, digital, and medical devices. So what we'll do during the time we have together is we're going to start with a brief discussion that frames what DRG sees converging and specifically what's driving that convergence. Well, then in the second section, I'm going to share some data that I have with you, so data from our digital market tracking resources. And what I'll use this content for is to help demonstrate stakeholder readiness for digital healthcare technologies and stakeholder willingness to engage with digital technologies in their care. In the last section, I'm going to share a framework that DRG has been using to evaluate convergence technologies. One of the biggest conversations that we're having with our industry clients and our industry partners is around how do I think about monetizing digital technologies? How do I think about evaluating the importance of these technologies to end stakeholders? So I'll show you a little bit about what we're doing there, and I'll also share some examples of two technologies that have a drug, a device, as well as a digital component. So where I'd like to start is that the idea of leveraging the value of a device for a drug therapy or of leveraging the advantages of a drug for a device therapy is well established. So as many of you will know, there are a number of drugs with low bioavailability that are reliant on device-enabled delivery. Here's where we think about things like injection needles, inhalers, insulin, pumps, nebulizers, things like that. Similarly, I think many of you will be familiar with how adding a slow-release pharmaceutical to a stent scaffold in the form of a drug-eluting stent revolutionized the treatment of acute coronary syndrome. This concept applies to a number of different drug-coated implantables. How I think about this is what frames a lot of our historical state, and in many ways what frames today's current state, where you have a siloed device industry and a siloed drug industry that do engage, but that mostly operate as separate industries. As we progress through our conversation, actually I think in the next slide I'm going to come back to this view and we'll add segments that I believe will be increasingly important as technology advancement enables combination products much beyond traditional drug plus device or device plus drug. So I was just mentioning that we've historically talked about two siloed industries, one for drug and one for device, and then traditional drug-device combinations that define our historical and present state. If we look into the future, however, I think that the landscape is changing dramatically, and there's a lot of demand for new combination products. Two very notable drivers of change are the addition of a technology component. So at the bottom here, we're thinking about things like chips and pills, sensors, but this is also extending to things like companion apps, data integration with electronic health records, or other contributory data models where data generated in a medical device is being used to overall quantify and qualify the health of a patient. The other disruptive force that we see in this picture of convergence is rapid scientific innovation in regenerative medicine. At a high level, we define this to include things like cell-based therapies, gene therapies, and tissue therapies. We're not going to talk about regenerative medicine much today, so we'll focus a bit more on the digital side. But when we think about these additional factors taken into consideration, our drug-device combination options expand from traditional things like injections and inhalers that I noted to include various biomaterials, to include chip and pill designs, combination products inclusive of a companion app, and various other digital combinations. So I want to take some time here to look at how we're thinking about the categorization of the various digital combinations being developed. Across the landscape of different technologies, we're dividing the market into the following categories. We have this top section here around remote patient monitoring and diagnosis, and then there is a lot of work and a lot of investment into this idea of behavioral modification. And then there is work as well in telehealth. I think in combination, these three things categorize many of the technologies being developed within a broader segmentation for digital health. For our discussion today, we're going to focus mostly on these top two that I've highlighted here in red. From a clinical standpoint, chronic disease management sits in the bullseye of healthcare cost challenges, given that these conditions account for a large and growing proportion of overall spend. When we dissect chronic diseases, we think that three areas, namely heart conditions, mostly congestive heart failure, asthma, and COPD, account for more than about 20% of category spend, which is why we're seeing a lot of development specifically targeting those three high-burden clinical conditions. Okay. The focus on these specific conditions is translating to more active product development and pipeline in those areas. And what I'm showing here on the right is some examples that we'll dig a bit more deeply into. So specifically, as we talk more, we'll talk more about some of this work being done in COPD technology management, and we'll talk more about some examples in continuous glucose management systems. Okay. Here you'll see that part of the reason there's a lot of interest in development here is because there is a very high estimated revenue opportunity. So this estimate is being pulled from a Goldman Sachs report that was published last year that they've termed the digital revolution. In that publication, they forecasted the commercial opportunity for these areas of the digital health vertical to exceed $20 billion. Well, everyone recognizes that the trend is in its infancy, and at present the total revenue generation is likely only in the order of several hundred million. It's still been really surprising as DRG and I work with our clients as we've been exploring the space, talking to physicians, talking to hospital networks, talking to payers. What surprised me the most is the incredible level of enthusiasm and incredible willingness to explore digital technologies and to incorporate digital technologies into the healthcare practice. So it's still very early. There's still a lot of investment being poured in, a lot of people trying to figure out how to make these technologies the most effective, but really strong interest. I won't read these, but I've captured some quotes that you can read when the slides are posted that just highlight that perspective of a forecast for strong growth. I'm going to just move now to talk a little bit more about what's enabling this convergence, so what's happening in the background that's making patients, caregivers, and doctors really ready to adopt and to embrace some of these digital combinations. The primary thing that we're seeing is that the growth and evolution of the technology sector has enabled a really important paradigm shift into how key decision makers solve healthcare problems. So a lot of the stimulus for movement of tech applications into medtech has been really just tech evolution and accessibility. So there's a general interest in data to solve problems. So data-driven decision making. There has been a movement toward miniaturization of sensor components that just technically facilitate the use of these in implantable medical devices or digital components to chips. So a lot of what we're seeing in medicine is being facilitated by tech development that we're seeing in other aspects of our day-to-day lives. There's also been a lot of stimulus because of tech firm investment and tech to med device or tech to pharmaceutical partnerships to bring some of these technology options to market. The other one that's important to highlight in this top green box is the idea that stakeholders are increasingly ready. So things like the high penetration of smartphone technologies and people being less uncomfortable with digital data in the atmosphere about their health. It's enabling what we're seeing in digital combination products. Okay? So tech evolution is enabling two other things. It's enabling stakeholder engagement models. So even in the healthcare system, stakeholders are engaging more and more with data, with digital tools. And then it's also enabling this idea that we're shifting in healthcare outcomes. I won't go into this right box because it's exceptionally complicated, but the driver, just to emphasize, is tech evolution. Okay. So what does this all mean? So what we're expecting to see, and one of the major trends that we're watching, is that the idea of leveraging the value of a device for drug therapy or the advantages of a drug for device therapy is well established and people are comfortable with that. Okay? What's changing is that the technology advancement is increasing the potential for combination products beyond traditional drug plus device or device plus drug, and we're seeing increasingly sophisticated components that often include a digital component with a drug, a device, or both. One of the examples that we're showing here on the right is a sensor-enabled inhaler. So this inhaler is a fairly novel device that includes compliance technology. As you may know, non-compliance is a major obstacle for effective healthcare delivery and is especially problematic in the treatment of asthma. The National Institute of Health, for example, reports that non-compliance is the main treatment problem in as many as 70% of asthmatics. In an attempt to address this problem, Senso Inhaler was developed as a monitoring device that accurately measures the inspiratory flow rate and analyzes the amount of medication delivered through the inhaler. This gives patients and healthcare providers immediate feedback on inhaler operation and inhalation technique. While the initial focus for this device was on asthma, almost any inhaler product could benefit from this type of technology. One of the key implications of this type of convergence development is that drug and device and digital partners need to collaborate increasingly to bring novel therapies to market, and that has obvious implications on regulatory, competitive intelligence, stakeholder engagement, etc. As the medical device and more traditional drug delivery combinations converge with digital technologies, there are important implications to the commercial and regulatory pathway that these novel products will take. We're seeing a whole host of interesting partnerships forming to commercialize technologies that merge the ability to capture real-world patient data to optimize personalized decision-making or to optimize the functioning of a device. Diabetes is one of the most active areas of development, and this is an example of one of the key technologies being highlighted in that area. The center image here is of a Blue Star by WellDoc, which is a great example of an algorithm-driven predictive mobile device that requires a prescription from a licensed healthcare professional. So how this works is it's an app, but the app is dispensed by the pharmacy and is reimbursed by the health plan. Blue Star enables patients to self-manage their diabetes through real-time motivational, behavioral, and educational coaching. The FDA, which has recently issued a guidance document on mobile health applications, imposed specific regulatory criteria based on factors such as risk to the patient and the extent to which the digital component performs analysis and provides actionable results. So when we think about apps as components of medical technologies, they fall into one category, which is either a medical category where this one example fits, and then there is also a lifestyle category that doesn't have the same regulatory scrutiny but also isn't eligible for payment. Where this starts to get really interesting in my mind is that the silos of med device and pharma start to blur, and then some of the traditional regulatory lines also become blurred once you start thinking about these complex combination products. So it's something that we really need to watch. So how does the FDA allow the continued development of these advanced combination products without making an undue regulatory burden in the developers having to go through multiple development pathways to get these products to market? Okay. One of the other trends that I'd highlight is the idea of uncommon partnerships or non-traditional partnerships. For those of you that are not yet in industry, you may not know that it's fairly uncommon for industry to early stage in development do partnerships outside of core partners that they've worked with and they have a lot of comfort and familiarity with. But what we're seeing in the digital space is that data-driven partnerships are becoming increasingly important, and where we're seeing a ton of investment is actually by some of the big tech companies. What I'm showing here is just a number of really high-profile acquisitions that have happened over the last year and a half or so, where one of the biggest players now in the world of health data, health analytics, and health insight is IBM. And it's becoming one of the companies that can best deliver unique cognitive abilities of its partner in Watson Health. Okay. I'm going to give you a couple other examples on here, just how other companies are partnering. So J&J is doing some partnerships on intelligent coaching systems for preoperative and postoperative patient care, which are intended to provide targeted encouragement during the recovery process. So developing tools that the patient has via their smartphone when they're leaving the hospital that are intended to help them adhere to their post-recovery protocols, are intended to give them access to information if they start seeing post-surgical symptoms, and it's a way to try and improve overall surgical outcomes by giving the patient digitally enabled tools that they can use outside of the care of their physician or hospital. Medtronic is doing some really interesting work on leveraging advanced analytics and cognitive computing to develop a new generation of personalized diabetes management solutions. So they're looking across a whole suite of data inputs to combine device data with electronic health record data, potentially with insurance claims data, and potentially with population health data, with the ultimate aim being that in this, we're calling it contributory data model, but in this model where data is being fed in from multiple different resources, you may have the ability to predict health risk and to have warning signals in advance of an event that a patient is at high risk. Okay. The other interesting partnership that we're seeing in industry as a trend is that there's increasing partnership with payers. So pharmaceutical companies engage with payers all the time. That's a regular part of their product development as well as their product lifecycle management. But until recently, it would have been fairly uncommon for a medical device company to partner or to engage directly with a payer. But the payers are motivated to support digital health technologies in areas where the digital technologies address a clear unmet need, and because there are areas where the financial incentives for the payer are aligned to the financial incentives for the device companies wanting to get additional revenue for a device, and the payer wants to have patient engagement to have the device impact outcomes. Okay. So the payer is thinking that they have an opportunity to derive tremendous value from patient-generated data as long as the appropriate infrastructure exists for data privacy concerns and other things like that, and a lot's being developed in that area. Okay. I'm going to move on now just to show you some data from our digital tracking business. So in addition to a consulting service business, Decision Resources has a digital data business where we do ongoing pulse studies to just gather information about digital technology use and trends in digital technology from a payer, a provider, a physician, and a patient perspective. So I'm just going to highlight a couple things. So what this is showing is just a proportion of patients that use digital resources specifically in the course of their care. So 37% of the surveyed population is using a smartphone as a resource while actually at the doctor's office. So they might be looking up symptoms, they're using it as an active part of their care management. They're also using it before they see a doctor. Some are, validating or reviewing the doctor's recommendation after receiving a treatment plan, and many are using it to do their own research about the pros and cons of two drug options. one of the other questions that we're asking is around wearable technologies, and what this is summarizing is that there's fairly high interest in wearable devices with a belief that they could help manage your health. Okay? What's interesting here is there's still some concern, so the drawbacks and some of the barriers to greater use of digital technologies around expense and around privacy concerns and around fear of being monitored. But my speculation is that people that are of a younger generation, as they become patients in the system, that their entire history with digital technologies is going to make some of these things less of a barrier. Okay. The other conversation that's happening in industry is around the idea of a gateway where wearable owners, a commercial device, so a wearable Fitbit, things like that, those are commercial entry devices. They don't tend to be medical prescribed devices, but people that enter the wearable space or enter a space where they're using digital tools for health applications, they become way more likely to want to engage digitally for other parts of their care. So the purple line here is wearable owners, and the gray is just general online consumers. So when they start being engaged with a wearable, they also want to be more engaged digitally for other parts of their care. Okay. If I move now to think a bit about physicians, this is showing physicians wanting to start to engage. So again, just trying to highlight strong signals that people are increasingly ready. So you have in this one on the left, you have more than 30% of physicians that are saying they rely on information from digital communications with their patients to inform their care. Okay? The one on the right is saying we use digital technology to communicate with our patients remotely, and they believe this will drive better outcomes. So still with a lens that it's early, there's good early signs that people are willing to engage. In the last section, I know we're running a bit short on time. We're going to just move to show you a framework that we've been using, and then I'm going to show you one other technology example. So if you recall at the beginning, I told you that the conversation with industry clients is focused around, I want to do this because I think it has health benefits, but I also need to think about my commercial strategy, and I need to think about how do I make money in this model. So we're developing some frameworks in combination with our client partners around different ways that these digital technologies can make money. So one of which is that they're sold to drive quality outcomes, and this is where a lot of the early technology development has been. Okay? The second is that they can show a differential value, so two otherwise equivalent technologies, one with a digital component, one with not. The digital tool can get more share or can get more price. Okay. There's also a couple models where the data is being licensed to a bigger data repository to increase the value of that data. So data from a device going into an electronic health record or being married with the patient's health claims to provide more information than the claim would provide on their own. And then there's a couple models where it's looking at clinical patient targeting. So if I can identify what patients do best in a technology, can I run better clinical trials? If I can identify what patient engagement results in outcomes, can I do better disease monitoring? Okay. So I'm going to give you another example that highlights, I think, a lot of what I've talked about. So at the beginning, I had said that asthma was a big focus because of the burden associated with the disease. So Propeller Health has a small sensor that's attached to a patient's device. This sensor has a number of different functions, including that it tracks medication use, records time and location use. It also records air quality so that the patient can get some feedback about what types of situations, what locations actually result in an exacerbation event for them. And then the data can be transmitted back to the patient's care provider or to clinical researchers. The end goal was symptom control, and the health system advantage is that if you could control symptoms in patients with asthma or chronic obstructive pulmonary disorder, you could keep them out of the hospital. So any incremental spend in putting the digital tool on the device is easily paid for by minimizing hospital events. Interesting here, a lot of different partnerships. So these are very unusual partnerships. So pharma partnering with each other. So multiple pharma companies sort of co-collaborating for development, some tech partners, a payer partner. They partnered even with the government of Louisiana being interested in using it for health quality index measurements. So the broad partnership meant that many different stakeholders in the system were engaged during the development of this product, which also helped with adoption after the product had been released. Okay. A timeline for some of the major partnerships and how they brought this to market. And then here what's interesting is the other trend that we're seeing is companies pursuing multiple monetization strategies. So in this particular example, the outcomes were very positive. So the clinical outcomes had an 80% improvement in adherence because the patient got such immediate and appropriate feedback from the device. There was a decline in uncontrolled asthma, so in terms of outcome benefit, it was very statistically strong in this particular device. And then what this led to is reductions in hospitalizations, reductions in ER visits, and reductions in unscheduled office visits, which makes it a really easy case for the network providers to offset the cost associated with treating the sensor-enabled device rather than a traditional device. Okay. One other example that I'll highlight for you is Dexcom. I'd highlighted earlier that the continuous glucose monitoring and general technologies to show diabetes are really having high interest. So what this is a disposable sensor to measure glucose levels, and the transmitter on the sensor sends data wirelessly to a smartphone or receiver. Okay. This tracks the daily activities that influence glucose trends, and again, there's an app component that supports diabetes management and provides both the patient and the care provider feedback. Again, in this example, you see quite a lot of partnership, not as many as in the previous example, but still an attempt to engage multiple stakeholders in the development of the product. Similarly here to what I showed in the last slide is you also see multiple monetization strategies being pursued. So a couple highlights here is it has this Clarity technology has a share function, so the practitioners can monitor and provide improved diabetes management support, so they're being able to show a statistically significant improvement in glycemic control. Okay. They've also partnered with Google to help over time miniaturize the device as well as reduce the costs. And then they have a successful reimbursement and a successful engagement story with multiple payers. Okay. So that's where I'm going to stop for today. So I know that there's some questions coming in the chat. So I'll be happy to take any questions that the team has. And also I know that BMES will be making the slides available after this, and I'm also happy to take questions offline if people have follow-up that we don't have time for.
Thanks, Adrienne. This is Clark again. I think we have some questions that can be directed to you. First would be, what therapeutic areas do you think will benefit most from digital health?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. So I'd highlighted some of them. I think over the long run, where industry is going to invest first is those high-burden diseases. So things like diabetes, congestive heart failure, asthma. There's a couple reasons for that. There's an opportunity to engage throughout the progression of those diseases. So if you imagine for a diabetic, if you could have some lifestyle tools, digital lifestyle tools when they were pre-diabetic, and that those tools had increasing sort of functions or education management as somebody became an injection insulin dependent patient. You can develop a suite of products where the patient gets the benefit of having their digital tools change as their disease progresses, but also so that you can try to slow the disease progression and have a way to monitor your effectiveness in doing that. So I think that's where the initial focus is going to be. And then I think there's some other acute areas where we're already seeing it and we'll see more. So in cardiovascular implantables, for example, there's some interest in sensors as a way to do predictive events. That's another area where I think there will be a lot of development.
Thank you. Are there any concerns about data privacy?
Yeah, there's quite a lot of concerns about data privacy. There is a lot of concerns. I think the short answer is that those haven't been solved yet, and there's a lot of work still to be done around who owns the data. So if there is a digitally enabled device, does the device company own the data? Does it get owned by the host of the app? There's quite a lot of unanswered questions there, but it certainly is an important topic of conversation, especially considering the sensitive nature of some of this sensitive nature of some of this information.
Okay. Who is developing the digital tools? Is it the device companies or tech companies?
I think the answer to that is that it's mixed. I think there are some device companies that are attempting to do it themselves, but where I see it being done more successfully is in a device tech partnership. The reason for that is a couple-fold. The tech evolution, as many of the call-in listeners will know, is just so much faster than device design evolution. So when the device companies try to do it themselves, they end up at a place where by the time they get the device to the right place, the tech is out of date, and they don't have the tools to stay up to date with the tech development options. So the more successful way to do it, I think, is increasingly with a tech partner. Even if the tech partner brings the device company to the point where they would have to be engaged in taking it through regulatory, the partnership model, including tech, is going to be more successful, I suspect.
Speaking of regulatory, what is the regulatory environment for these types of combination products?
So for the apps themselves, the apps, if they are deemed to be medical apps, have to go through a special review. If the apps themselves are lifestyle apps or designated as lifestyle apps, they're non-regulated. The device combinations, they tend to have to go through first what is deemed to be, like, what part of the combination is the most important to the clinical efficacy of the product. So if the FDA determines that the drug has a bigger role to play in clinical efficacy, it has to go through a drug pathway. If the device has more to play, it goes through a device pathway. But it also depends on whether or not the drug is a pre-approved and it's being combined after approval with a device. So I think the answer is it really depends, but that it's fairly complicated, and no matter what is pursued, it has to go through multiple levels of review, including a review by the Office of Combination Products.
So we've got some more specific questions here. When you mentioned the 12 million unit, what did that mean? Was that the number of people?
I don't recall what that was in reference to. Is there any more information on the question?
If the asker could please, the person who was asking that question could please maybe provide some more information, we can come back to it. But it was in reference to the 12 million unit people. We'll go on to another question. In the personalized medicine type technologies, will patients have access to all or any of the information? Is it just the doctor? Is it both? Does it depend on the technology? Can you talk about that?
Yep. Yeah, so the answer is it depends on the technology. One of the, in my opinion, I think one of the most important things that's going to drive whether some of these technologies succeed or fail is the extent to which the patient is involved. Because what we see with the digital apps, especially and with a lot of the digital technologies, is there's a patient fall off at the 3-4 month mark if the patient doesn't actually feel like they're getting appropriate feedback. So right now it can be both. Some of them go straight to the doctor, some of them the patient sees full access. But I think the ones that will succeed over time, especially in the behavioral modification category, will succeed because the patient gets feedback and the patient sees a lot of ongoing and daily value in the technology.
Okay. Can you elaborate some more on IBM Watson and big data analytics?
So not really, I'm not sure what the heart of the question is, but how we're watching that is between IBM and Watson's really focused on cognitive learning and data, like machine learning data ecosystems. So where you can have a lot of unstructured data and that the machine learning ecosystem can use that unstructured data to try and make predictions about health outcomes in very specific patient subpopulations. I don't admittedly know a ton of the specifics about what IBM Watson is doing in its entirety, but what I thought was really interesting about it as we just watched the space is the size of some of the acquisitions that they're doing. So their most recent one, for example, was a $2.6 billion acquisition with Truven Healthcare, and Truven Healthcare has a huge repository of commercial claims data, state claims data. They do a very good job of predicting sort of the volume of patients and patient outcomes in a lot of different areas. So taking the Truven acquisition helped IBM focus on it focused on a core of cloud-based healthcare analytics, so bringing together all of these major different data inputs in a way that doesn't require them to be structured, and then being able to use all of this unstructured cloud-based data to do predictive health analytics and to do patient segmentation outcome analysis. If the person that asked that question wants to talk more, I'm also happy to chat offline.
Yeah,
it's a big one. Yeah, for sure.
What kind of training do clinicians need to interpret data from these combination devices? Do you see training happening for clinicians, and do you expect there to be a learning curve for the clinician users?
Mm-hmm. So if the companies do a good job at the development, most of the data is pretty easy to interpret. Most of the data is pretty easy to interpret. The device companies are doing a pretty good job, I think, of training when that is necessary. There's another layer to this question which is important around, do the doctors have the right incentive to look at the data? So in some cases, they may not, they don't get paid to look at the data in some circumstances. So what's their incentive to actually look at the data when they could have the patient come in for a visit? So some of what has to change is more payment models, and there are some now, but more payment models that actually incent the doctor and pay the doctor to look at the data so that they don't need the patient to come in to talk about the data in order for it to be effective. There's also some workflow considerations. So in many cases, maybe the nurses monitor the data, except if there's obvious flags in the data that would indicate a patient risk or indicate a change in the patient's clinical condition that warrants the doctor's attention. In that case, it's a practice workflow discussion around how that information gets flagged to the clinician.
All right, I think we have time for one more question. How do you think, and this is sort of a long one, how do you think the regulatory landscape needs to adapt with regards to the use of health trackers that promote specific training or dietary modifications toward better personalized health in healthy users. Clinical decision algorithms can be used for patient interventions. Do you think there's a difference when it comes to healthy individuals looking to lower overall risk later in their lifetime?
Yeah. So right now, most of what I'm seeing in that is going to get put into a bucket of lifestyle, and regulatory isn't going to monitor it. So right now, the FDA and in Europe as well, they've said, unless we think that the app poses a patient risk, it's not going to be managed. So it's an interesting question. So I don't think the regulatory needs to change necessarily, unless some of these things are showing that they're changing patient behavior enough that they are causing a risk. I think what's interesting here is you might see payers wanting to support these in some way. So could you imagine a scenario, for example, where a payer gives people a little bit of rebate back on their deductibles or lowers their copay by a little bit if they show adherence to a healthy lifestyle app, because there would be an incentive for the payer to try and minimize the risk event. That in somewhere like I live in Canada, in somewhere like Canada where there was a national payer, you could see more incentive to do that. I think in the U.S. the difficulty is that the payers know they're not going to keep the patients for years and years. Right? The average turnover is going to be 18 months to 2 years. So there's not a lot of incentive right now for people to get involved and to try and really push those types of health promotion apps. So I guess the overall answer is I'm not really sure, but that would be something for us to continue to watch.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, Adrienne. That was very informative. And I think, like you said, if any of the listeners have additional questions, they can certainly submit them to BMES and we can route them to you. So this concludes our webinar. Thank you for joining us. Please stay online and take a few minutes to complete the brief webinar evaluation before you go. We would greatly appreciate your feedback. We would also like to remind you the webinar is being recorded for your convenience. The slides and archived audio recording will be available on the BMES e-learning page. You will be notified by email when the archived materials have been posted. We hope you will join us again for other BMES events. To learn about upcoming BMES activities and events, please visit bmes.org. Thank you.